Judith Harmon stood on the concrete front porch of her son's house. She held a manila folder pressed flat against the pastel wool of her cardigan. She knocked twice on the heavy wooden door. The sound echoed hard and sharp against the still afternoon air. No one answered. She knocked again. She leaned her weight into her knuckles. Silence settled right back over the porch the second she stopped. The late Tennessee afternoon sun baked the steps. The smell of fresh-cut grass drifted over from the neighbor yard. Everything on the street looked ordinary. She stepped sideways. Her sensible shoes scraped against the welcome mat. She cupped her hands around her face and pressed her nose close to the front window glass. The living room inside was empty. The beige sofa was gone. The soft area rug was gone. The framed wedding photographs no longer sat on the mantel. The only thing left on the far wall was a pale, clean square of paint where the television had hung for the last 4 years. She shifted her gaze slightly, looking through the open archway toward the kitchen. On the bare island counter, illuminated by a single dusty shaft of sunlight, sat one brass house key and a blank white envelope. I was not there to see the expression on her face. I did not watch her process the empty room. Derek told me about it 3 days later. His voice sounded thin and hollow over the phone as he explained how his mother had stood on that porch for almost an hour. He said she just stayed there, frozen on the concrete, until a neighbor finally walked across the lawn to ask if she needed a glass of water. Hearing him say it brought me no joy. There was no sudden rush of victory. There was only the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who had spent months clawing her way out of a burning house. My name is Kelsey Harmon. I am 28 years old. I work as a labor and delivery nurse at the University Medical Center in Knoxville. I spend my days bringing families into the world, and I spent my entire life trying to find one of my own. 6 weeks earlier, I could not walk from my bed to the bathroom without leaning my entire body weight against the drywall. I was 10 days out from an emergency cesarean section. The surgical incision burned with a sharp, pulling heat every single time I shifted my hips. Ivy was crying in the bassinet beside the mattress. It was a thin, reedy wail that scraped directly against my exhausted nerves. Derek had gone back to his office at the logistics company that morning. I was alone in the house. At least, the house sounded empty. The front door opened. I heard the brass deadbolt click, followed by the solid thud of the door closing. Footsteps moved purposefully across the hardwood floor in the hallway. I had not given anyone a key. Derek had given his mother a spare years ago for emergencies. Judith walked into my bedroom without knocking. She carried a glass baking dish covered in aluminum foil in one hand and a canvas diaper bag over her shoulder. She did not look at me. She walked straight past the foot of my bed and bent over the bassinet. She scooped Ivy up before the baby could take another breath. You look exhausted. Sweetie, Judith said. She kept her eyes on my daughter, adjusting the swaddle blanket with practiced, aggressive efficiency. Why do you not sleep? I have her. I pushed my palms into the mattress and forced myself into a sitting position. The stitches pulled tight across my lower abdomen. I gritted my teeth, waiting for the burning sensation to pass. I just fed her 20 minutes ago. She is fine in the bassinet. Babies need holding, Kelsey, she said. She bounced Ivy against her shoulder. Not just feeding. You will learn. You will learn. She delivered the phrase with a sweet, maternal smile that did not reach her eyes. The words slipped right under my ribs like a cold knife. She was not offering help. She was delivering an assessment. And the sour taste of old coffee sat in the back of my throat. The sour taste of old coffee sat in the back of my throat. Every muscle in my body strained toward my daughter. The instruction to put her down pressed hard against my teeth, but the words stayed trapped right there. I grew up in 4 different foster homes before I turned 18. Every time I had spoken up as a child, every time I had pushed back against a house rule or complained about a borrowed sweater, I found my trash bags packed by the front door the next morning. You do not argue with the people who let you stay. When I married Derek, I did not just marry a man. I married an entire family. I started calling Judith Mom. I learned to bake her holiday recipes. I let her pick the centerpieces for our wedding. I paid for my seat at their table by stripping away pieces of myself until I fit perfectly into the space they allowed me. I watched her walk my baby out into the living room. I laid back down against the pillows. The ceiling fan spun in slow, lazy circles above me. I turned my head toward the dresser. Judith had left a handwritten congratulations card propped against the mirror. Her handwriting caught my eye. It was the kind of cursive they do not teach in schools anymore. Every letter was deliberate. Every loop was strictly controlled. Beside it, taped to the glass, was my plastic hospital wristband. I will be back tomorrow. Judith called from the hallway a few hours later, right before the front door clicked shut. Same time. It was not a question. The next 4 weeks blurred into a suffocating, airless routine. Judith arrived every morning at 9. She brought casseroles I could not eat and advice I did not ask for. During the second week, I came out of the shower to find a mechanical baby swing assembled in the middle of the living room. I had not bought a swing. I had explicitly told Derek we did not have the floor space for one. Judith was plugging it into the wall. She smiled and said Ivy needed motion to digest properly. I went back to the bedroom and closed the door. By the third week, my sleep deprivation had become a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Judith offered to take Ivy overnight, just one night. She promised, so I could get 8 consecutive hours of rest. I caved. My body desperately needed the sleep. The next morning, she brought Ivy back wearing a ruffled pink onesie I had never seen before. The tags had been cut off. The onesie I had packed in the overnight bag was nowhere to be found. Week 4 brought the pamphlets. I found Judith's leather purse sitting on the kitchen chair after she left for the afternoon. It was unzipped. Sticking out of the main compartment were 3 glossy brochures about severe postpartum depression. The bold letters across the front asked if I was struggling to connect with reality. She had made sure they were visible. The message was impossible to miss. The breaking point arrived in the 5th week. I was folding burp cloths on the sofa when I noticed an email notification on my phone from the pediatrician patient portal. A note about changing Ivy's formula. I had not called the doctor. Judith was washing dishes at the sink. The hot water ran over the plates, sending steam up into the sunlight filtering through the blinds. "Judith," I said. My voice came out flat. "Did you call Dr. Pham's office this morning?" She turned off the faucet. She dried her hands on a dish towel, taking her time. I had a question about the formula switch. "You were sleeping." I gripped the edge of the burp cloth. I am her mother. I should be the one talking to her doctor. And I raised a son who turned out just fine. Did I not? She folded the towel and laid it over the edge of the sink. "Relax, sweetie. It takes a village." Later that evening, after the house had gone still, I stood in the bathroom and stared at the mirror. I looked at my hospital wristband taped to the glass. Ivy's tiny matching band was taped right beneath it. Judith had stood in this spot 3 days ago. She had pointed at the plastic bands and frowned. "You should put those in a scrapbook, sweetie," she had said. "Clutter on the mirror is not great for your mood." I walked into the living room. Derek was sitting on the sofa with his laptop. I told him about the pediatrician. I told him his mother was making medical decisions for our child. He did not look up from the screen. "She is just trying to help, Kels. You know how she is." I stood there in the dim light of the television. He was right. I had seen exactly how she was for 4 years. When I was 7 months pregnant, she suggested the name Ivy. It was her late mother-in-law's name. A strong Harmon name, she had called it. I had agreed because I had no family names of my own to offer. The bassinet was her choice. The doctor was her recommendation. And the name belonged to her family. Ivy was 6 weeks old the first night I stayed awake purely by choice. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2 in the morning. The room was dark, except for the faint, cool glow of my phone screen. Ivy was asleep in the bassinet, her breathing a soft, steady rhythm through the baby monitor on the dresser. The faint smell of sour milk clung to the shoulder of my faded blue scrubs. I had not changed clothes in 2 days. I was on a video call with Petra. She lived in Stuttgart now. We had shared a bedroom in a foster home outside Memphis when I was 12, and she was 15. She was eating breakfast in her bright, sunlit kitchen while I sat in the dark. I told her about the pamphlets. I told her about the pediatrician. I kept my voice low, a whisper that barely carried over the sound of the air conditioning kicking on. Petra stopped buttering her toast. She looked directly into the camera. The delay over the connection made her silence stretch out longer than it should have. "If it ever gets too much," Petra said, her voice dropping the casual tone we usually shared. "You have a room here. Always. You know that, right?" I forced a small, tired laugh. I rubbed the back of my neck. "It is fine. She is just intense. She means well." We disconnected a few minutes later. I set the phone on the mattress. My throat was dry. I slid out of bed, careful not to let the floorboards creak, and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was silent. The refrigerator hummed a low, constant vibration against the linoleum floor. I poured a glass of water from the tap. As I turned around, I bumped against the edge of the kitchen table. Judith's leather purse was sitting on the middle chair. She had forgotten it again. This was the 3rd time in 2 weeks she had left something behind, forcing an excuse to return early the next morning. I sighed and reached for the strap, intending to move it to the front console table. The bag was unzipped. A manila folder stuck out from the main compartment, wedged between a makeup bag and a leather wallet. The edge of the folder was bent, exposing the top corner of the paperwork inside. I saw my own name printed in black ink. Kelsey Harmon. I did not want to look. Every survival instinct I had developed over 2 decades told me to walk away. But the logo printed above my name locked my feet to the floor. Peachtree Family Services, Atlanta, Georgia. We lived in Tennessee. We had no business with a family services agency in Georgia. I set my water glass on the counter. My fingers were numb as I reached into the bag and pulled the folder free. The pages rattled slightly in the dim room. I opened it under the dim yellow light above the stove. The title of the document sat bold and centered at the top of the page. Voluntary Relinquishment of Parental Rights. My lungs stopped pulling in air. I read the words again, then read the paragraphs below them. The legal jargon blurred together, but the meaning was brutally clear. It was a formal petition to surrender custody of a minor child. I flipped to the second page. At the bottom, on the line marked biological mother, was a signature, Kelsey Harmon. It was not my signature. I stared at the blue ink. The letters were clean and precise, the loops deliberate, every curve strictly controlled. It was the same handwriting from the congratulations card sitting on the shelf in Ivy's bedroom. Judith had signed my name. Beneath the legal form was a typed letter. I traced the lines with a trembling finger. The words burned into my vision. The biological mother, a former foster child with no family support system, has expressed her inability to care for the infant. The prospective adoptive parent, Judith Harmon, a retired educator with a stable home and excellent community standing, is prepared to assume full legal custody. She was not trying to help me sleep. She was not trying to take over the doctor appointments. She was trying to adopt my daughter. If this form went through an out-of-state agency, bypassing the local courts where someone might actually check on me, she would become Ivy's legal mother. My name would be erased from the birth certificate. I would become exactly what the letter described: a foster kid who gave up her baby, a woman who abandoned her child. The cold kitchen floor seemed to drop out from beneath my feet. I had spent my entire childhood being a child no one kept. I had twisted myself into knots, trying to be worthy of the Harmon family name. And now, the woman who had welcomed me with open arms was actively constructing a reality where my daughter would be taken away from a mother the world decided was simply not good enough. I placed my hand flat against the document. The paper was rough against my dry skin. I looked up. Through the open doorway, I could see the edge of the bassinet in my bedroom. I could hear Ivy breathing. The knot of fear that had lived in my chest for 28 years completely evaporated. It was replaced by a cold clarity. I was not going to sleep tonight. I might never sleep in this house again. I sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours. The sky outside the window shifted from pitch black to a bruised, pre-dawn purple. I did not cry. I did not panic. I took my phone and opened the camera. I photographed the relinquishment form. I photographed the typed letter. I photographed the envelope addressed to the agency in Atlanta. I emailed every single image to my personal account and uploaded them to a secure cloud drive. When I finished, I carefully slid the folder back into Judith's purse, making sure the bent corner sat exactly as I had found it. 2 paths formed in my head. I could pack the diaper bag, strap Ivy into the car seat, and drive until the gas tank hit empty. Or I could stay and fight a woman who had 32 years of community respect backing her up. At 6 a.m, I heard the shower running in the master bathroom. Derek was getting ready for work. I waited until he walked into the kitchen, buttoning his collar. He looked at me, sitting at the table in the dark. "You are up early," he said. He reached for the coffee pot. "Your mother forgot her purse," I said. My voice did not shake. "I will drop it off at her place on my way to the office." I kept my hands folded in my lap. There are papers inside it. Adoption papers. For Ivy. She forged my signature on a voluntary relinquishment form and sent it to an agency in Georgia. Derek stopped moving. The coffee pot hovered inches from his mug. He slowly set it down on the counter. He did not look surprised. He looked caught. "Kels," he started. He rubbed his hand over his jaw. "She mentioned something about looking into options. I figured she meant daycare. She had me sign some papers last week. You signed a legal document," I said. I kept my hands flat on the table. "About our daughter." Without reading a single word. "I was tired," he said, his voice pitched up, defensive. "She said it was routine. She said it was just authorization for agency consultation so we could get some overnight nursing help." "She lied to you. She is just worried about you," he said. He took a step toward the table. "You have been so exhausted, Kels. Maybe she figured you needed a break. She sent them to Georgia, Derek, to an adoption agency. I will talk to her," he said. He grabbed his keys from the counter. "Just calm down. Let me handle it." He was making excuses. He was choosing her version of reality because it was easier than standing up to her. He was not the architect of this nightmare, but he was holding the door open so his mother could walk it right into our home. I stood up. "Do not touch her purse. Go to work." He stood in the kitchen for a long moment before walking out the front door. I pulled my laptop open. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen. I typed "Family Lawyer Knoxville" into the search bar. I bypassed the massive corporate firms and scrolled until I found a small practice downtown, Kovac Family Law, specializing in difficult custody disputes. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. It was 6:47 in the morning. A voicemail system beeped in my ear. "My name is Kelsey Harmon," I said. I used my nurse voice, the tone I used when reporting a critical patient crashing in the trauma bay. My mother-in-law forged my signature on a voluntary relinquishment form and sent it to an adoption agency in Georgia. My baby is 6 weeks old. I need help today. I carried Ivy into Nina Kovac's office the next morning. The building sat on a narrow downtown street. The stairs up to the second floor were steep and covered in faded brown carpet. Inside, the office smelled strongly of dark roast coffee and fresh printer ink. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a faint, erratic rhythm. Legal pads were stacked in uneven towers across a wide, cluttered desk. Nina Kovac was 42 years old. She wore a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail. She did not wear makeup. She looked at me, then looked at Ivy sleeping in the plastic car seat by my feet, and then looked back at me. She read the printouts of the photographs I had taken. She did not speak for 2 full minutes. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic thumping of a copy machine running in the hallway. "This is not a custody petition," Nina said. She set the papers down and picked up a red pen. "You understand that, right?" "She is trying to adopt my daughter," I said. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap. The leather chair squeaked slightly as I shifted my weight. "She is trying to erase you." Nina tapped the pen against her desk. "A voluntary relinquishment means you chose to give up your baby. If this goes through an agency in Georgia without Tennessee court involvement, and they process it before anyone flags it, she becomes Ivy's legal mother. And what happens to me?" I asked. My throat was bone dry. "You become a name in a sealed file," Nina said. "Can she do that?" "She can try," Nina said. She leaned forward and rested her forearms on the desk. "She forged your signature. That is a Class C felony under Tennessee law. She filed with an out-of-state agency to avoid Tennessee courts where someone might actually know you. And she used your foster care history as justification. This is calculated." My chest tightened. The air in the small office suddenly seemed too thin to breathe. I looked at the printed copy of the typed letter. The words, "former foster child," stared back at me. Judith was not merely overstepping her bounds as a grandmother. She was constructing an alternate reality. She was weaponizing the deepest wound of my childhood, twisting my past to prove I was unfit to have a future. She intended to turn me into the exact kind of mother I had spent my entire life fearing. A woman who walked away. Nina stopped tapping her pen. She held my gaze. Her professional edge dropped away, leaving something raw and sharp underneath. "I lost my daughter when I was 26, Nina said. Her voice dropped lower, competing with the hum of the fluorescent lights. Her father had money. I did not. It took me 3 years to get her back. 3 years of someone else reading her bedtime stories. I looked down at the floor, processing the silence hanging between us. "That is why I do this," Nina continued. "And that is why I am telling you. Do not confront your mother-in-law. Do not warn your husband. We move first, and we move quiet." She slid a contract across the desk. I reached out and picked up the red pen. My hand was shaking. I pressed the tip to the paper and signed my name. The ink flowed smooth and dark across the bottom line. It was my real signature. For the next 4 days, I built a case while living in enemy territory. Nina called the agency in Atlanta the moment I left her office. The agency representative confirmed they had received the file and placed it in the review queue. They froze it immediately the second Nina faxed over a letter of dispute along with a copy of Ivy's birth certificate. I used my employee access at the University Medical Center to request my own records. The hospital records department printed the files for me in a stack. I sat in my car in the parking garage and flipped through the pages until I found the anesthesia logs. The timeline laid out in stark, black and white ink. I received general anesthesia at 2:47 in the afternoon. I woke up in the recovery room at 3:31. The forged consent form Judith had submitted was dated for 3:15 on that same day. I was physically unconscious on an operating table at the precise moment she claimed I signed my daughter away. I also searched the house while Derek was at work. Inside his home office desk drawer, beneath a stack of utility bills, I found the paper he had signed. Authorization for agency consultation. The language was vague, full of legal jargon about assessing childcare needs. But the word agency was right there at the top. He had enough information to ask questions. He chose to look away. The hardest part was going home and playing my part. Judith still arrived every morning at 9. She still brought covered baking dishes. I had to let her hold my daughter. My stomach twisted into tight, sick knots every single time she lifted Ivy out of the bassinet. I forced the muscles in my face to relax. I smiled. I said, "Thank you, Mom." I treated every interaction like a critical shift in the trauma ward. Every time Judith held Ivy against her shoulder, I stared at the clock on the wall and counted my own heartbeats. I counted them the same way I counted contractions for my patients. Steady, measurable, under control. I survived each visit by silently repeating the details of my medical records in my head. On the 5th day, I stood in a Knox County courtroom. I wore my faded blue hospital scrubs. I had officially returned to work for light-duty shifts, a strategic move Nina suggested to prove to the court that I was fully functioning and employed. Ivy slept in her plastic car seat on the floor beside my chair. The courtroom smelled strongly of damp granite and lemon floor polish. The bright neon lights from the hallway reflected off the glass panels dividing the room. We were there for an emergency hearing. The judge sat high behind an elevated bench. He reviewed the emergency petition Nina presented. He read the copy of the forged Georgia agency form. He studied my hospital anesthesia records. The scrape of his pen against the paper echoed in the large room. He signed the emergency custody order, granting me sole physical and legal custody. The order barred any outside adoption petitions moving forward without my direct written consent. We walked out into the echoing hallway. Nina walked beside me, holding the case file. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished stone floor. "This is good," Nina said. She stopped at the elevator banks and pressed the call button. "It feels over," I said. I shifted the diaper bag higher on my shoulder. "It is only beginning," Nina replied. "This is the easy part. What is the hard part?" "The hard part is what Judith does when she finds out," Nina said. She turned to face me as the elevator doors slid open. "Women like her do not lose quietly, and she has not been served yet." I drove home through the late afternoon traffic. The official court order sat on the passenger seat beside me. I looked at the stack of paper at every red light. For the first time in my entire life, I held a document that legally stated I belonged to someone, and someone belonged to me. A judge had looked at my daughter and declared she was mine to protect, but the paper was cold against my fingers. The legal victory existed on the page, but the physical reality of my life remained untouched. The house I was driving back to still had a spare key resting in the kitchen drawer of Judith's home. I pulled into my driveway as the sun dipped behind the trees. The porch light was already on. Judith's silver sedan was parked near the garage doors. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I picked up the court order, folded it in half, and shoved it deep into the bottom of my diaper bag. I grabbed the car seat handle and walked up the front steps. I pushed the front door open. The house was silent. The teenage babysitter I had hired for the afternoon was gone. Her backpack no longer sat by the entryway. I walked into the living room. Judith was sitting in the center of my sofa. Ivy was resting against her pastel cardigan, her tiny head tucked beneath Judith's chin. Judith looked up when I walked into the room. A wide, practiced smile stretched across her face. "There she is," Judith said. She patted Ivy's back with a slow, rhythmic motion. Grandma was getting worried. I walked across the living room carpet. I did not drop my diaper bag. I reached down and lifted my daughter out of Judith's arms. Ivy shifted against my chest and settled into a deep sleep. "I need the house key back, Judith," I said. Her smile faltered. The corners of her mouth twitched. It was the first time in 4 years I had addressed her by her actual name instead of calling her Mom. "What is going on, sweetie?" Judith asked. Her voice held a perfectly manufactured tone of gentle concern. "I know about Peachtree Family Services," I said. I kept my voice level, anchoring myself to the solid weight of my daughter in my arms. "I know about the form. I know you forged my signature." The grandmother mask cracked. It did not shatter, but the warm, maternal illusion vanished from her eyes. She did not deny the accusation. She did not even attempt to lie. She immediately justified her actions. "I was protecting that baby," Judith said. She dropped the sugary tone. Her voice turned hard and sharp. "You can barely take care of yourself. You are exhausted. You have no family to help you. You are a product of the foster care system, Kelsey. What kind of life can you possibly give her?" "Give me the key," I said. "Leave my house. My lawyer will contact you." Judith reached into the pocket of her pastel cardigan and pulled out her cell phone. She dialed Derek and pressed the speakerphone button. The dial tone echoed loudly in the still living room. "Derek?" Judith said. Her voice suddenly trembled. She manufactured a breathy, wounded panic. "Your wife has lost her mind. She is threatening me. You need to come home right now." A long beat of static filled the air. "Mom," Derek said over the speaker. He sounded exhausted. "Maybe you should go home tonight." Judith ended the call. She pulled the brass house key from her pocket and dropped it onto the glass coffee table. The metal clattered loudly against the surface. She walked toward the front door. She paused with her hand resting on the brass knob. She did not turn around to look at me. "You think a piece of paper from a judge changes anything?" she said softly. "I have friends in this town. You have no one." The door clicked shut. 3 days later, a woman in a gray suit knocked on my front door. She wore an identification badge around her neck from the Department of Children's Services. The woman held a thick plastic clipboard against her chest. She explained she had received an anonymous report from a concerned neighbor. The report claimed I appeared overwhelmed and was possibly neglecting my infant daughter. My professional training as a hospital nurse took over. I invited the social worker inside. I showed her the spotless kitchen. I showed her the fully stocked diaper station in the living room. I handed her the spiral notebook where I logged every single ounce of formula Ivy consumed. The social worker smiled, handed my notebook back, and apologized for the intrusion. She assured me the case would likely be closed quickly, but the formal file was still opened. The official record of a complaint existed in a government database. That was exactly what Judith intended. The community whisper campaign started by the weekend. I walked Ivy down the street in her stroller on a Sunday afternoon. A neighbor who usually waved from her porch quickly turned away and hurried inside her house. Judith had spent 32 years teaching elementary school in the next town over. She had deep, generational roots in her church congregation. She was making phone calls. She was planting seeds. The story she spun was simple and devastating. Kelsey is suffering from severe postpartum psychosis. She is keeping my grandbaby away from the family out of pure paranoia. Derek came home late that evening. He stood in the kitchen doorway while I washed plastic bottles in the sink. The silence between us held. "Are you sure you are okay?" Derek asked. He kept his distance, leaning against the doorframe. "Maybe you should talk to a professional. Mom says you are acting paranoid." "Your mother forged a legal document," I said. I set a wet bottle on the drying rack. "She is filing a petition for grandparent visitation rights," Derek said. He looked down at his shoes, unable to meet my eyes. Her lawyer says Tennessee allows it when a parent is unfit. The soap bubbles popped against my wet skin. Judith had successfully shifted the entire narrative. She was no longer the criminal who forged a legal document to steal a child. She was the desperate, loving grandmother trying to save a baby from an unstable mother. The anonymous agency report served as her medical evidence. The church community served as her character witnesses. My own husband stood in our kitchen, validating her perspective. I dried my hands and walked into the nursery. The room smelled of baby powder and clean cotton. The soft glow from the moon-shaped nightlight cast pale shadows across the walls. I looked around the room. Judith had picked the sage green paint color for the walls. Judith had purchased the expensive wooden bassinet. Her fingerprints covered every single surface of my child's life. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called Nina Kovac. "The anonymous report will be dismissed as unfounded," Nina said through the receiver. "Grandparent visitation in this state requires showing an unreasonable denial of access. You have a felony forgery charge backing your denial. She will not win, but," I said, catching the slight hesitation in her voice, "she will make it expensive. She will make it exhausting. That is her strategy now. She does not need to win in court. She just needs to drain you of your resources until you give up." The call ended. The house went still. I sat down on the carpet right beside the bassinet. The floorboards were cold through my thin scrub pants. I watched Ivy's chest rise and fall in the dim light. My past unspooled in the darkness of the nursery. I pictured the front screen door of my third foster home. I pictured myself standing on the porch with all of my belongings stuffed into a black garbage bag. I was waiting for a social worker to pick me up because I had asked for a second serving of dinner, and the foster mother decided I was too demanding. I spent my entire life making myself small. I swallowed my opinions. I baked casseroles from recipes I hated. I let a woman I barely knew name my own daughter. I did all of it just to earn a place at a dinner table. I traded my own voice for the illusion of belonging to the Harmon family. But this family was now trying to take away the only person who actually belonged to me. A profound shift happened deep in my chest. The desperate, lifelong need to be accepted by Derek and his mother vanished. It left nothing but clean ash. Ivy needed a mother. She did not need a woman who would disappear just to make other people comfortable. Protecting my daughter meant protecting myself. I had to become someone who stayed. I picked up my phone from the carpet. I opened my text messages and scrolled down to the conversation with Petra. I read her last message again. "You have a room here, always." I did not type a reply. I just stared at the bright screen in the dark room. For the first time in 28 years, the word always sounded like a promise someone actually intended to keep. I finally had a way out. The next morning, I walked into Nina Kovac's office carrying a different kind of exhaustion. The suffocating weight of fear was gone. A sharp, focused energy had taken its place. The kind of energy that only arrives when a person has absolutely nothing left to lose. I sat down in the leather guest chair. I did not wait for Nina to open her legal pad. "I refused to fight Judith in Knoxville for 2 years, I told her. "She has deep roots here. She has a church congregation and a bridge club and 32 years of elementary school parents who view her as a saint. I do not have anyone." Nina set her red coffee mug on the desk. "What are you planning?" "I demand full custody," I said. My voice held steady. "I need the felony forgery charge filed with the police department today. And I am relocating." "Relocating where?" "Germany," I said. "I have family there." Nina leaned back in her chair. She studied my face for a long moment before picking up her pen. She laid out the legal process with practiced precision. Tennessee law allowed a custodial parent to relocate out of state or out of the country with good cause, provided they gave a 60-day notice. An exception existed within the statute. If the non-relocating parent agreed in writing, the court could waive the waiting period and approve the move immediately. Derek will likely consent, Nina said. Contesting the relocation means the court will review exactly why you received emergency custody in the first place. The evidence of his mother forging legal documents and his own enabling behavior will become part of a public hearing. His defense attorney will advise him to sign the consent form immediately to avoid the exposure. We drafted the strategy right there. Nina would file the formal criminal complaint for felony forgery and fraud. She would file the divorce petition. We would present a relocation plan that included a generous schedule for video calls, and she would demand that Peachtree Family Services provide written confirmation that the adoption file was entirely fraudulent. Sealing the record at the federal level, 2 weeks later, the foundation of Judith's perfect life collapsed. Nina received a phone call from Judith's defense attorney the following Tuesday. He described what happened when the process server walked up the concrete steps of the brick house in Maryville. The server handed Judith a thick envelope containing 2 separate legal actions. The first was a criminal charge for a Class C felony. The second was a petition for a no-contact restraining order, requesting the court prohibit her from coming within 500 feet of me or my daughter. For the first time in 62 years, Judith failed to control the expression on her face. She immediately hired an expensive defense attorney and demanded he file a motion to dismiss. Her own lawyer sat her down in his polished conference room and laid out the reality of her situation. She had forged a signature while her daughter-in-law was under general anesthesia. The hospital records confirmed the timeline. A handwriting expert had already matched her loops and curves to the forged consent form. The agency in Georgia had officially flagged the file. He advised her to cooperate before the district attorney decided to make a public example out of her. Her sweet grandmother mask finally slipped in front of her own counsel. She shouted that she was saving her grandchild. She called me a foster child who had no business raising a baby. Her lawyer put his pen down and stated he could not help her if she kept talking. I saw her later that week inside the Knox County Courthouse. We were sitting at opposite tables in the large room. The air conditioning hummed a low, freezing note. Nina stood before the judge and presented the 3 pieces of evidence that destroyed Judith's entire defense. First, Nina submitted a photograph of my plastic hospital wristband, showing my admission time down to the minute. She paired it with the hospital anesthesia log. Together, they proved I was unconscious on the operating table at the precise moment the forged consent form was dated. Next, Nina placed the handwritten congratulations card right beside the forged agency paperwork. The handwriting was identical. Finally, Nina presented a sworn affidavit and a formal letter of support from Petra in Stuttgart, detailing my living arrangements and establishing that I was moving toward a secure, stable support system. I sat in my chair and looked across the aisle. Judith looked diminished, sitting at the defense table. The afternoon of my wedding reception echoed in the dim room. Judith had hugged me tight, kissed my cheek, and whispered welcome to the family. Tears of genuine gratitude had fallen that day. Her words had sounded like an offer of unconditional love. Sitting under those fluorescent lights brought a clarity that arrived years too late. The welcome had never been an embrace. It was an invitation into a cage. Derek sat in the back row of the gallery. He did not sit behind his mother. He did not sit behind me. When the judge read the final order into the record, granting me full custody, approving the international relocation, and making the no-contact restraining order permanent, Derek looked down at his hands. He stood up slowly, turned his back on the room, and walked out the double doors without saying a single word. Judith remained seated. She was alone. A thick manila folder sat on the table directly in front of her. It looked exactly like the folder I had pulled from her leather purse, but this time, the paperwork inside held her own sentence. The packing took less than 2 weeks. My house emptied out room by room. I kept only my clothing, Ivy's belongings, a plastic bin of important documents, and my laptop computer. I sold the dining table and the guest bed. I donated the mechanical baby swing and the pastel blankets to a local charity. Derek came over on a Tuesday evening to sign the final separation agreement and the relocation consent forms. Tennessee required a 90-day waiting period to finalize a divorce when minor children were involved. But the terms were already locked in place. Nina would finalize the paperwork from her downtown office while I was gone. Derek stood in the center of the bare living room. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt. He walked over to the plastic infant carrier resting on the kitchen counter. Ivy was awake, staring up at the ceiling lights. Derek bent down, brushed his thumb against her small cheek, and pressed a long kiss to her forehead. He stepped back and shoved his hands deep into his pockets. "I should have read those papers," Derek said quietly. His voice cracked on the last word. I stood on the other side of the counter. I did not reply. I did not offer him absolution. There are some mistakes in life that a simple apology can never fix. I left my house key sitting on the kitchen island. Beside it, I placed a blank white envelope. I had written a new email address across the front, specifically created for the video calls he was allowed to schedule. I picked up my daughter, walked out the front door, and never looked back. The McGee-Tyson Airport was nearly empty on a Thursday morning. Sunlight poured through the massive glass windows lining the single terminal, casting bright, warm squares across the polished floor. I stood near the gate with Ivy strapped securely to my chest in a soft fabric carrier. She squirmed slightly against my collarbone, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the shoulder strap. My new passport rested in my jacket pocket. Right beside it was a second, much smaller passport. It bore the name Ivy Joy Harmon. I had kept the Harmon family name for her. Ivy had a right to the name she was born with. Derek and Judith did not own those letters. The smell of dark roasted coffee drifted over from a nearby cafe kiosk. I sat down in a row of empty black chairs and pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen lit up with a new text message from Petra. "The room is ready," the message read. "Ivy's crib is set up. I bought the same moon nightlight you described. I will see you in 9 hours." I locked the screen and let out a long, shaky breath. The bassinet surfaced in my mind, still sitting in the empty nursery back in Knoxville. Judith had picked it out. Judith had purchased it. Judith had assembled it in the nursery while I was recovering in bed. I had never actually chosen it. The sage green paint color for the walls had been her decision. The pediatrician down the street had been her recommendation. Even the name Ivy had been a suggestion handed down by a woman acting out of pure superiority. For 4 years of marriage and 6 weeks of motherhood, I had never truly chosen a single thing. But I chose Stuttgart. The gate agent picked up the intercom microphone and announced the first boarding call for our flight. I stood up and adjusted the straps across my back. Ivy woke up at the sudden movement. Her dark eyes opened wide, staring up at the bright fluorescent lights paneling the ceiling. I leaned my head down until my cheek rested against her soft hair. "I am not going anywhere," I whispered into the warm space between us. I had spoken those same words to her in the delivery room the night she was born. The promise carried a different weight now. It meant I was staying with her, no matter what continent we stood on. The airplane engines roared to life 30 minutes later. We accelerated down the runway, the wheels lifting smoothly off the tarmac. I looked out the small oval window as the city of Knoxville shrank into a grid of tiny streets and scattered trees. In the distance, the great Smoky Mountains rose against the horizon. They were the same mountains I had stared at through my kitchen window every single morning for 4 years. I turned my head away from the glass. Ivy slept peacefully against my chest, lulled by the deep vibration of the plane. Her tiny hand reached out in her sleep and wrapped around my index finger. It was a tight, secure grip, the unconscious reflex of a newborn baby holding on to whatever she could find. I wrapped my fingers around hers and squeezed back. And that was not a reflex at all.